In 1938, a war was not stopped, it was only postponed. Around a table in Munich, European leaders believed they had secured peace. But there was one thing not represented at that table: the future. The Munich Agreement sacrificed one nation and made a global war inevitable. This was not a peace deal. The Munich betrayal, a comprehensive strategic analysis, the shadow of Verdun. The year was 1938, but for the soul of the European continent, it was still 1914. To truly understand why the world stood by as a sovereign nation was dismembered, one must look deep into the bleeding heart of the post-war era. Europe was not a continent of progress in the late 1930s. It was a vast open-air asylum haunted by the restless ghosts of the First World War. Exactly 20 years had passed since the armistice. Yet the Great War remained the central, defining trauma of human existence. In every French village, in every British industrial town, and in every German city, the loss of an entire generation of young men had created a psychological vacuum. This was not just collective grief. It was a deep, pathological terror of the sound of a drum. The fields of Flanders and the mud of Verdun were not just places on a map. They were scars on the European psyche. When politicians in London and Paris discussed national interest, they were not thinking of borders or trade. They were thinking of the mustard gas, the relentless artillery barrages that turned men into dust, and the millions of decomposing bodies in the trenches. This trauma birthed a new political religion, appeasement. Led by Neville Chamberlain and Edouard Daladier, this strategy was rooted in the desperate, perhaps delusional belief that the slaughter of 1914 could never be repeated if only they were reasonable enough. By 1935, Adolf Hitler had already begun testing the resolve of these paralyzed powers. He publicly announced the existence of the Luftwaffe and reintroduced military conscription. These were direct violations of international law. Yet the West did nothing but issue formal protests. In 1936, Hitler took his biggest gamble: the remilitarization of the Rhineland. German military archives later revealed that the Wehrmacht divisions involved had strict orders to retreat if they encountered even a single French division. But France stayed behind its Maginot Line, and Britain remained disinterested. This lack of response established a dangerous precedent. The Western powers would prioritize the avoidance of immediate conflict over the enforcement of international treaties. By early 1938, after the annexation of Austria, the strategic encirclement of Czechoslovakia was a geographical reality. The Czechoslovakian military power. Czechoslovakia, in 1938, was not a weak or disorganized state. It was the only functioning democracy in Central Europe and possessed one of the world's most advanced arms industries. The Czechoslovakian army consisted of 35 highly trained divisions and was supported by an industrial base that was the envy of the continent. The Skoda works in Pilsen and the Zbrojovka factory in Brno produced artillery, machine guns, and tanks that were, in many cases, superior to their German counterparts. The Czech LTVZ-35 tank, for instance, featured a 37mm main gun and superior armor compared to the German Panzer I and II models that made up the bulk of the Wehrmacht's armored strength. The heart of the Czech national defense was the Sudetenland. This mountainous border region housed a massive network of modern fortifications. These were not just simple bunkers. They were integrated underground fortresses equipped with heavy artillery, anti-tank guns, and air filtration systems designed to withstand chemical warfare. Military analysts of the time believed that these fortifications could hold off the German army for months, providing enough time for French and Soviet intervention. Hitler was fully aware that a direct frontal assault on these defenses would result in catastrophic casualties for the Wehrmacht. Hitler's strategy was to destroy Czechoslovakia from within. He utilized Konrad Henlein, the leader of the Sudeten German Party, to manufacture a domestic crisis. Henlein's instructions from Berlin were simple: always demand so much that we can never be satisfied. By framing the crisis as an issue of national self-determination for the 3 million ethnic Germans living in the Sudetenland, Hitler managed to confuse the international community. Every minor street brawl was magnified by Goebbels's propaganda machine into a state-sponsored massacre. By September 1938, the rhetoric coming out of Berlin had transitioned from diplomatic complaints to open threats of total invasion. Hitler set a hard deadline. October 1st, the Munich Summit, the Table of Dishonor. On September 29, 1938, the fate of the world was decided in a cold, ornate room in Munich. There were 4 chairs at the table: Neville Chamberlain, Edouard Daladier, Benito Mussolini, and Adolf Hitler. The most staggering historical fact about the Munich Conference is not what was discussed, but who was not there. The representatives of Czechoslovakia, the nation whose territory was being carved up, were barred from the room. They were treated like criminals awaiting a verdict, forced to wait in the hallway under Gestapo guard. The Soviet Union was also pointedly excluded. By ignoring Moscow, Chamberlain and Daladier signaled to Joseph Stalin that the Western democracies were perfectly willing to cut deals with Hitler at the expense of Eastern European security. This exclusion was the primary catalyst for the Nazi-Soviet pact that would shock the world just 1 year later. Inside the conference room, there was no real negotiation. Hitler simply presented a list of demands, and the others looked for ways to say yes. Daladier was in a state of mental collapse, knowing that France was breaking its sacred word to an ally. Chamberlain, however, was proactive, believing he was securing a lasting European settlement. The Munich Agreement was signed at 1:30 a.m. on September 30th. Its terms were a death sentence for Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland was to be handed over to Germany in stages, beginning on October 1st. All military installations, fortifications, and industrial equipment were to be surrendered intact. The Czech government was presented with an ultimatum: accept the terms or face the German army alone. Facing total isolation and abandoned by its friends, the Czech government surrendered. This was the Munich betrayal, a moment where the morality of the West collapsed under the weight of its own fear. Peace for our time and the lone prophet. Neville Chamberlain returned to London on the afternoon of September the 30th, 1938, convinced he had achieved a diplomatic miracle. At Heston Aerodrome, he held up a piece of paper signed by Hitler and famously declared, "I believe it is peace for our time." The British public, desperate to avoid the slaughter of 1914, cheered him as a hero. However, the atmosphere inside the House of Commons was chillingly different. In the shadows of the back benches sat Winston Churchill, who had spent years warning that Hitler could not be stopped with ink and paper. When Churchill rose to speak, he did not join the chorus of praise. Instead, he delivered a terrifying prophecy. You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war. He argued that the Munich Agreement was a total and unmitigated defeat. He pointed out that by giving Hitler the Sudetenland, the West had handed him the keys to the continent and the Skoda Works, one of the largest arms factories in Europe. Churchill knew that the 35 well-equipped Czech divisions surrendered without a shot would one day be replaced by German divisions that would face British soldiers. He understood what Chamberlain ignored. Hitler viewed the Allies not as partners in peace, but as weak parasites. The Peace of Munich lasted for exactly 167 days. In March 1939, Hitler violated every promise. He ordered his troops into the rest of Czechoslovakia, occupying Prague without a shot. The guarantees given by Britain and France vanished into thin air. Hitler had achieved his greatest victory without firing a single bullet. He had gained the wealth, the industry, and the strategic heart of Europe. The policy of appeasement was dead, and Chamberlain was humiliated before the entire world. The bitter harvest. The strategic failure of 1938 led directly to the catastrophe of 1939. By the time Britain and France finally issued a guarantee to Poland, the balance of power had shifted decisively in Germany's favor. Hitler, emboldened by the cowardice he had witnessed in Munich, moved for the final act. In August 1939, the Nazi-Soviet pact was signed, dividing Poland between Hitler and Stalin. On September 1, 1939, the German Wehrmacht crossed the Polish border, and the Second World War began. The tragedy of Munich was the loss of the last real chance to stop Hitler while he was still vulnerable. The world chose a temporary, dishonest peace over a difficult but lasting justice, and paid the price with 60 million lives. As Churchill had predicted, the bitter cup had finally reached the table, and the world was forced to drink it to the dregs. The legacy of Munich remains a permanent lesson. That weakness in the face of aggression only guarantees a more terrible conflict in the future. If you'd like to continue exploring these irreversible decisions of history together, your subscription and following would be the most valuable support for the continuation of this narrative. Please like and subscribe to support more content like this.